I won't interfere. But understand something, I am not a man who shares.
The 51st floor was silent. Downstairs, TK Group was a frantic machine of noise and deadlines. But up here, the air felt expensive and still. It smelled of crisp, starched cotton and the faint metallic scent of a space that was cleaned with clinical precision. Samira adjusted the lapel of her blazer as she stepped out of the elevator. She had spent 2 years in the logistics department, working twice as hard to be noticed. Today was the result of that grind, her first day as the personal assistant to Kim Tae-jun. She pushed open the heavy glass doors to the corner office. The room was vast, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the gray sprawl of Seoul. Tae-jun didn't look up. He was leaning over a long table, reviewing a set of documents. He had his jacket off, his white shirt tucked perfectly into dark trousers. He looked like a man who demanded perfection because he provided it himself. "You're early," he said. His voice was a low, calm baritone that seemed to settle in the pit of Samira's stomach. 3 minutes, Samira replied, stepping further into the room. "I believe that's the standard for this floor." He finally looked up. His face was a study in controlled elegance, dark, unblinking eyes, and a jawline that looked carved from stone. He didn't smile, but he didn't look displeased. He simply watched her, his gaze heavy and analytical as it traveled from her eyes to the tablet in her hand. "Most people find the silence up here uncomfortable," he said, rising slowly. He moved with a quiet, easy grace, walking around the desk until he stood a few feet from her. He was tall, and his presence seemed to swallow the light in the room. "They try to fill it with nervous chatter. I don't have time for chatter." "Then we'll get along fine, Mr. Kim," Samira said, meeting his gaze. "I'm here to work, not to talk." He stepped a fraction closer. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was a physical weight. Up close, he smelled of cedar and something sharp, like the air after a storm. His eyes dropped to her mouth for a heartbeat before returning to hers. It wasn't a look of desire, not yet. It was the look of a man who was used to owning everything he looked at. "Good," he murmured. The door opened behind them. A man in a suit entered, bowing a few degrees lower than a typical employee would to a CEO. "The 9 a.m. meeting has been moved to the boardroom, sir." Tae-jun didn't turn around. He stayed focused on Samira for a second longer, his expression unreadable. "My schedule is in your hands now, Samira. Don't let me down." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers so slightly it could have been an accident. But the heat that radiated from him lingered long after he left the room. Samira exhaled, her fingers tightening on her tablet. She had expected a challenge, but she hadn't expected the man himself to be the most difficult part of the job. The first week was a lesson in the art of anticipation. Samira quickly realized that being Kim Tae-jun's assistant wasn't about following instructions. It was about knowing what he needed before the thought had fully formed in his mind. He didn't offer praise, and he didn't offer guidance. He simply existed at the center of a high-velocity whirlwind, and it was her job to make sure the air around him stayed perfectly still. By Wednesday, she had mastered the rhythm. She knew he took his black coffee at 7:45 a.m., and that he preferred physical files over digital ones for his daily briefings. She also noticed that he was a man of absolute silence. He didn't hum, he didn't fidget, and he didn't make unnecessary noise. Tae-jun was a quiet presence in his own office. He moved with a heavy, easy grace, often appearing behind her while she was focused on a spreadsheet. "The logistics report for the Incheon terminal," he said one afternoon. He didn't tap her shoulder or clear his throat. He was just there, standing so close to her desk that his shadow draped over her keyboard. Samira didn't jump. She had learned that flinching didn't suit the atmosphere of this floor. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a blue folder, handing it to him. "I flagged the discrepancies in the docking fees, Mr. Kim. The nighttime slots were calculated incorrectly." Tae-jun took the folder, his fingers brushing against hers. He didn't pull away immediately. Instead, he stood there, his hand lingering near hers for a second longer than necessary. It wasn't a caress. It was just a heavy, grounded pressure. "You're thorough," he murmured. "I'm efficient," Samira replied, finally turning her chair to face him. He was looking down at her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her forehead, before settling on her gaze. The office was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting a golden, hazy glow over his sharp features. "Most people see the numbers and move on," he said, his voice dropping to a low hum. He leaned down, bracing one hand on the edge of her desk, boxing her in without actually touching her. "They don't look for the patterns." "The patterns are where the work is," she said, her heart doing a slow, rhythmic thud against her ribs. Tae-jun's eyes remained on hers, unblinking. For a moment, the professional distance between them seemed to evaporate, replaced by a thick, silent tension that made the room feel smaller. He wasn't acting like a boss. He was simply a man watching a woman who didn't back down. He straightened up abruptly. "Finish the audit by 6, he said, his voice returning to its usual, clipped tone. "I want it on my desk before you leave." He walked back into his inner office, leaving Samira staring at the space he had just occupied. She was learning the rules of his world, but she was starting to realize that the hardest rule to follow was keeping her focus on the paperwork instead of the man who signed it. By the second week, the sun began setting before Samira even thought about clearing her desk. The 51st floor at night was different. The city lights crawled up the glass walls, and the silence felt less like a vacuum and more like an intimate weight. Tae-jun was still in his office. He was always still in his office. Samira walked in with the final logistics audit. He was sitting at his desk, his head resting against the high back of his leather chair, eyes closed. For a split second, the mask was down. He looked human, exhausted in a way that made her chest tighten. Her gaze lingered on the sharp line of his jaw and the way his pulse moved steadily in his throat. She stood there a second too long, just watching the rise and fall of his chest. "You're staring, Samira." His eyes didn't open, but his voice, low and gravelly from a day of silence, cut through her thoughts. Samira felt a flush creep up her neck. She set the audit down on the edge of his desk with a deliberate click. "I was waiting to see if you were awake, Mr. Kim," she lied smoothly. He opened his eyes then, dark and sharp, pinning her in place. He leaned forward, the motion bringing him into the pool of light from the desk lamp. "I'm always awake. Bring the chair over. I want you to walk me through the Incheon numbers." Samira hesitated, then pulled a chair around to his side of the desk. As she sat, their knees were inches apart. The proximity was startling. Up close, the scent of him, that crisp, clean cedar and starched cotton, was overwhelming. She leaned over to point at a line of data, and her shoulder brushed against his arm. He didn't move away. He didn't even flinch. He just watched the paper, though his breathing seemed to grow a fraction deeper. "Here," she whispered, her finger trembling slightly as she traced the column. "The margin is off by 2%. It's consistent across every nighttime delivery." Tae-jun didn't look at the paper. He was looking at her hand. Then, slowly, his gaze traveled up her arm, settling on her face. The office was so quiet she could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall and the heavy thud of her own heart. "You have an eye for things that don't belong," he murmured. "I like things to be where they should be," she replied, her voice breathy. He reached out, his hand hovering over the desk, before his fingers brushed against hers as he took the pen from her hand. The contact was electric, skin against skin in the quiet dark. He didn't let go immediately. He kept his hand there, a warm, heavy anchor, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, Samira forgot the audit. She forgot the company. She was just a woman sitting in the dark with a man who felt like a storm waiting to break. "It's late," he said softly, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Go home, Samira." He pulled his hand away, the loss of contact feeling like a physical ache. As she gathered her things, she realized she wasn't just working for him anymore. She was falling, and the floor was nowhere in sight. The morning air in Seoul was crisp, but inside the back of the black sedan, it was stifling. Tae-jun had decided he needed her for a series of off-site meetings at the district offices. It was the first time they had been confined in a space smaller than his sprawling office. Samira sat in the leather seat beside him, her tablet balanced on her lap, trying to focus on the briefing notes. It was nearly impossible. Every time the car took a sharp turn, her thigh brushed against his. He was a solid, warm weight next to her, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been molded to his frame. He was reading a physical newspaper, his long fingers turning the pages with a rhythmic, snapping sound. He didn't look at her, but she couldn't stop looking at him. From the corner of her eye, she traced the clean line of his profile, the straight bridge of his nose, the way his dark hair was swept back from his forehead, and the slight, persistent tension in his jaw. "You're holding your breath again, Samira," he said, not lifting his eyes from the paper. She blinked, startled. "The traffic is just heavy today. The driver is capable. Relax." He folded the paper and set it on the seat between them. He turned his head then, his dark eyes fixing on hers. The proximity in the car was different than the office. Here, there was nowhere for the tension to go. It just sat between them, thick and humming. A sudden motorcycle cut in front of the car, forcing the driver to slam on the brakes. The jerk sent Samira sliding toward him. Her hand flew out to steady herself, landing squarely on his chest. Underneath the fine silk of his shirt, his heart was beating with a slow, steady power. She could feel the hard muscle of his pectoral, the heat of him seeping through the fabric and into her palm. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up at him. Tae-jun didn't move. He didn't push her away, and he didn't help her up. He simply looked down at her hand on his chest, then back into her eyes. His expression was a mask, but his pupils had blown wide, turning his eyes into bottomless pools of black. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, rough vibrato. "No," she whispered, but she didn't move her hand. She couldn't. It felt like she was touching a live wire. He reached up, his hand closing over hers. His skin was warm, his grip firm, as he slowly moved her hand off his chest and back to her own lap. He didn't let go immediately. His thumb brushed across her knuckles in a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "Stay centered," he murmured, finally releasing her. He turned back to the window, leaving Samira trembling in the quiet. He was acting like nothing had happened, but the way he adjusted his collar and the sudden, sharp set of his shoulders told her that for the first time, he was just as aware of her as she was of him. The lobby of TK Group was a glass and steel cathedral of corporate vanity, and usually, Samira moved through it like a ghost. But as she followed 3 paces behind Tae-jun toward the private elevators, the atmosphere felt different. The morning's contact in the car was a ghost limb she could still feel. The heat of his chest still burned in the palm of her hand. Tae-jun was on his phone, speaking in clipped, low-frequency Korean that sounded more like commands than conversation. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply knew she was there. As they neared the gold-leafed elevator bank, the mid-morning rush was at its peak. A group of junior analysts, frantic and buried in their tablets, came charging around a marble pillar. The leader of the pack, a tall man blinded by the stack of files in his arms, didn't see the woman in the charcoal blazer until it was too late. "Watch it!" the analyst started to yell, his shoulder set to collide squarely with Samira. Before Samira could even brace herself, a hand shot out. It was fast, faster than she thought a man in a 3-piece suit could move. Tae-jun's arm bypassed her shoulder, his hand landing flat against the analyst's chest with the force of a slamming door. The young man stopped dead, the papers in his arms fluttering like wounded birds to the floor. "Mr. Kim!" the analyst gasped, his face draining of color as he looked up. Tae-jun didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He stepped into Samira's space, his body a literal shield between her and the crowd. He placed his other hand firmly on the small of her back, a possessive, grounding weight that seared through her silk blouse. The contact was brief, but it was the first time he had touched her with such clear intent. "Apologize," Tae-jun said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a lethal, quiet edge that made the nearby security guards straighten their spines. I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't see her," the analyst stammered, bowing so low his forehead nearly hit his knees. "My apologies, miss." Tae-jun's hand lingered on Samira's back for a heartbeat longer than necessary. She could feel the steady, rhythmic heat of his palm, the pressure of his fingers claiming the space around her. She looked up at him, her breath hitching. His eyes weren't on the analyst anymore. They were on her. They were dark, intense, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something raw and territorial behind the CEO mask. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was for her, but his eyes were scanning her face as if looking for a bruise he'd have to avenge. "I'm fine, Mr. Kim," she whispered, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could feel it through her back. He didn't let go until they were inside the elevator and the doors had hissed shut. The silence in the small gold box was suffocating. Samira leaned against the railing, her skin still tingling where his hand had been. "Don't let them crowd you," he said, staring straight ahead at the digital floor display. "In this building, you are an extension of me. Act like it." He didn't look at her, but the way his knuckles were white told her everything she needed to know. She was falling for a man who didn't just want her efficiency. He wanted her safe, and he wanted her his. The incident in the lobby had changed the air between them. It was no longer just about logistics and coffee temperatures. There was a heavy, unspoken acknowledgement that he had claimed her space. Late that Thursday, the cleaning crews had already moved through the executive wing, leaving the floors gleaming and the air smelling of lemon polish. Samira was walking back from the archives, a stack of folders pressed to her chest. The lights in the long hallway had dimmed to their nighttime setting, casting long, amber shadows across the carpet. She saw him at the end of the hall. Tae-jun was leaning against the wall outside his office, his head tilted back, eyes closed. His tie was loosened, and his top button was undone. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man who had been fighting a war all day. Samira slowed her pace, Her heart started that familiar, slow roll. She tried to tell herself to just walk past, to give him a professional, "Good night, Mr. Kim," but her feet had other plans. She stopped a few feet away. "You should go home," she said softly. Taejun's eyes opened slowly. He didn't move his head from the wall. He just watched her, his gaze heavy and dark in the dim light. "The work doesn't go home, Samira. It just waits." "It'll wait until 8 a.m., she countered, stepping closer. He straightened up then, his height suddenly looming over her in the narrow hallway. He didn't step back. He stepped in. He moved until the folders in her arms were pressed between her chest and his. The hallway felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in until the only thing in the world was the sound of his breathing. He reached out, his fingers brushing the stray hair away from her temple. His touch was light, almost a ghost of a sensation, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. His hand didn't drop. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, lingering near the corner of her mouth. "You're very persistent," he murmured, his voice a low, rough velvet. "I'm good at my job," she whispered, her breath hitching as his thumb grazed her lower lip. "Your job is to assist me," he said, his gaze dropping to her mouth. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could feel the heat of him, see the slight tension in his lips. "It isn't to worry about me." "I can't help it," she confessed, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. Taejun's hand tightened slightly on her jaw. For a second, she thought he might actually close the gap. The tension was so thick it was a physical ache. Then, he let out a sharp, jagged exhale and stepped back, breaking the circuit. "Go home, Samira," he said, his voice cold again, though his eyes remained dilated. "Before you find something you can't handle." He turned and walked into his office without looking back, leaving her trembling in the hallway, the taste of his presence still burning on her skin. The following Tuesday, a sudden shift in a major merger meant the 51st floor didn't go dark at sunset. By 11 p.m., the only light in the executive suite came from the glowing monitors on Taejun's desk and the low-slung designer lamps that cast long, amber pools across the floor. Samira walked into his office with 2 cups of black coffee. The steam curled into the chilled air, carrying the bitter, earthy scent that had become the soundtrack to their nights. Taejun was hunched over a spread of physical contracts, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the corded muscle of his forearms. "You should have left hours ago," he said, not looking up. His voice was a dry rasp, worn down by hours of silence. "And leave you to miscalculate the equity split? I don't think so," Samira replied. She set his coffee down beside his hand. He finally looked at her, his eyes shadowed with a fatigue that made him look humanly vulnerable for the first time. He didn't say thank you. He simply reached for the cup. As he did, his fingers wrapped around hers, lingering on the warm ceramic. He didn't let go. He just looked at her, the silence between them stretching until it felt like a living thing. "Sit," he commanded softly. She pulled her chair to the side of his desk, closer than was strictly professional. They bent over the documents together. To anyone else, it would have looked like a standard strategy session, but to Samira, it was a minefield. Every time she reached over to highlight a clause, her shoulder brushed his. Every time he spoke, his low voice vibrated through the small space between them. "The holding company in Singapore is the weak point," she murmured, leaning in to point at a line of text. Taejun leaned in with her. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at the way her hair had fallen forward, exposing the elegant curve of her neck. He moved, his hand coming up to rest on the back of her chair, effectively caging her. "Explain why," he said. His breath ghosted over her ear, sending a violent shiver down her spine. Samira tried to focus, but her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Because the tax laws changed last month. If we don't restructure, we lose the leverage. Tae-jun didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his chest nearly touching her shoulder. He smelled like espresso and the deep, cold cedar of his suit, a combination that made Samira's head swim. He reached for her pen, his hand covering hers entirely. He didn't take the pen, he just held her hand against the paper, his thumb tracing the delicate bone of her wrist. "You're very sharp, Samira," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky thread. She turned her head slightly, and suddenly, they were inches apart. The glow from the monitor caught the dark intensity in his eyes. He wasn't looking at the contract. He was looking at her mouth with a hunger that was barely contained. "Mr. Kim," she started, her voice breaking. "Don't," he interrupted, his gaze locking onto hers. "Don't call me that. Not tonight." The air in the room felt thick enough to choke on. He didn't kiss her, but he stayed there, his hand a heavy, possessive anchor on hers, letting her feel the raw power of his focus. It was a silent declaration. He knew she was falling, and he was letting her know exactly how deep the drop was. The TK Group's annual stakeholder reception was an exercise in sterile luxury. The grand hall was a sea of black tuxedos and champagne flutes, but the atmosphere was far from celebratory. It was a battlefield of posture and quiet negotiations. Samira stood near the edge of the ballroom, dressed in a sleek, floor-length midnight blue gown. She wasn't there as a guest. She was there to manage Tae-jun's evening. She kept her tablet discreetly at her side, her eyes scanning the room for the next person on his must-greet list. Tae-jun was at the center of a circle of elders, looking every bit the sovereign. He was in a tuxedo that seemed to sharpen his edges. Despite the crowd vying for his attention, his gaze drifted toward Samira every few minutes. It wasn't a look of affection. It was the steady, grounding check-in of a man who needed to know exactly where his center of gravity was. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the company on those beautiful shoulders," a light, melodic voice said behind her. Samira turned to find a man she didn't recognize. He was handsome in a soft, approachable way, a sharp contrast to Tae-jun's jagged intensity. He wore a silver-gray suit and a smile that reached his eyes. "I'm Ethan Choi," he said, tilting his head. "I'm with the architecture firm handling the new terminal project. I've heard rumors that Mr. Kim has a new shadow, but I didn't realize the shadow was so radiant." Samira felt a small, professional smile tug at her lips. Ethan's energy was easy, a breath of fresh air. "I'm just his assistant, Mr. Choi, and I believe radiant is a bit much for a Thursday night." "Call me Ethan, and I disagree," he replied, stepping a fraction closer, his tone playful. "I've been watching you manage this room for 20 minutes. You're the only person here who looks like they aren't trying to sell something." Samira opened her mouth to reply, but the air around her suddenly turned cold. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt the shift in pressure. Tae-jun appeared beside her. He didn't touch her. That would be a breach of the very rules he enforced, but he stood so close that the sleeve of his jacket brushed her arm. He loomed over the conversation, his mere presence effectively turning the space into a private office. "Ethan," Tae-jun said. His voice was a low, flat baritone. He didn't offer a hand to shake. "Tae-jun," Ethan replied, his smile faltering slightly under the weight of the older man's gaze. "I was just introducing myself to your new assistant. She's quite impressive." Tae-jun didn't look at Ethan. He looked down at Samira, his eyes dark and unreadable. The silence stretched a second too long, making the professional moment feel heavy and charged. "She is busy, Ethan," Tae-jun said. He turned his body slightly, a subtle move that physically blocked Ethan's view of her. The chairman is asking about the terminal's structural permits. I suggest you find him before he finds your father. It was a dismissal, wrapped in a corporate suggestion. Ethan nodded, his eyes lingering on Samira for a heartbeat before he retreated into the crowd. Tae-jun didn't move. He stayed in her space, the scent of him, crisp linen and that cold, metallic edge, replacing the floral scent of the ballroom. He didn't look at her, instead focusing on the middle distance. Your job tonight is to monitor my schedule, Samira, he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that only she could hear. Not to entertain the architects. I was just being polite, Mr. Kim, she whispered back, her pulse racing. Be polite on your own time, he countered. He finally looked at her, and for a split second, the coldness cracked to reveal a sharp, jagged irritation. On mine, you stay where I can see you. He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Samira breathless. He hadn't touched her, yet she felt more marked by his jealousy than if he had. The rain began as a dull roar against the glass of the penthouse office. It was nearly midnight, and the adrenaline of the corporate event had faded into a thick, electric exhaustion. Samira was packing her bag, her mind still replaying the way Tae-jun had blocked Ethan's path. It hadn't been a professional correction. It had been a claim. She walked toward the door, but the elevator was already chiming. It wasn't Tae-jun. The doors slid open to reveal Ethan. He was still in his silver-gray suit, though he had ditched his tie. He held a small, elegant gift bag. I realized I never got to finish our conversation, Ethan said, stepping into the suite. His smile was softer now, less architect and more man. And I didn't get to give you this. It's just a specialty blend of tea from the terminal site's region. I thought you might need it for the late nights. Samira froze. Ethan, you shouldn't be up here. Mr. Kim isn't here, Ethan said, taking a step closer. He reached out, his hand gently brushing her arm as he offered the bag. You don't have to be afraid of him, Samira. He's just a man. A very powerful, very lonely man. I'm not afraid, she said, her voice betraying her with a slight tremor. Good, because you're too bright to be stuck in his shadow forever. Ethan leaned in, his intent clear. A friendly, lingering closeness that felt like a challenge to the coldness of the floor. The sound of the heavy office door opening was like a gunshot. Tae-jun stood there. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair slightly disheveled from the rain. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like the shadow Ethan had just mentioned. Dark, looming, and dangerous. The air in the room didn't just turn cold. It vanished. Ethan, Tae-jun said. His voice was so low it was almost a growl. I don't recall authorizing your access to this floor. I was just leaving, Tae-jun, Ethan said, though he didn't move away from Samira immediately. He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. Good night, Samira. Ethan walked past him, the tension so thick the air felt like it might snap. As the elevator doors closed, the silence that rushed back in was suffocating. Tae-jun didn't move. He stood by the door, his chest rising and falling with a heavy, jagged rhythm. Then, he walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his shadow completely swallowing her. He looked down at the gift bag in her hand, his eyes flashing with a raw, territorial heat. You like his attention? Tae-jun asked, his voice a rough, dangerous velvet. He was just being kind. Kindness is a luxury people in this building can't afford, he interrupted. He reached out, his hand gripping the edge of the desk behind her, pinning her between his body and the wood. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was a physical assault on her senses. He leaned down, his face so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and for the first time, the mask was completely gone. If you want him, tell me now. His breath ghosting over her lips. If you choose him, I won't interfere. He paused, his jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. But understand something, Samira. I am not a man who shares. If you stay, you are mine, completely. Outside, the headlights of a black car idled in the rain, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum. Taejun didn't look away. He waited for her answer, his hand trembling slightly against the desk, the only sign of the war raging inside him.